Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back through time to a world of quiet stone cloisters, gently echoing chants, and the earthy aroma of barley mash drifting through candlelit halls. You're standing at the threshold of a medieval monastery, probably barefoot because let's be honest, sandals weren't always required, but they were basically monk uniform. It's early evening, the sun's dipping low, casting amber light through stained glass, and somewhere inside a massive wooden vat is softly bubbling, sending up tendrils of steam scented with malt and herbs. That's right, we're talking about beer, monastic beer. Not the stadium stuff or your roommate's Friday night six-pack, but rich, cloudy, holy beer brewed by some of the most disciplined, prayerful and oddly experimental men in medieval Europe. It may sound like a quaint scene, but here's the twist. If you'd been born in the year 1150 and tried to live like these guys, even just for a week, you probably wouldn't survive it. Their daily diets alone would wipe out most modern stomachs, and then there's the 6 pints of beer they drank, per day, during fasting, on purpose. And yes, they still showed up for 3 a.m. choir practice, barefoot. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what's the local time right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step carefully along the cool, smooth stone of the abbey's floor, and your ears catch the rhythm of soft chanting from the chapel nearby. The monks, wrapped in rough wool robes, shaved tonsures reflecting the candlelight, are just finishing vespers, the evening prayer. They've been up since before sunrise, working, praying, and yes, brewing. The scent leads you to a low-beamed room off the main hall. Copper kettles shine dully, and a haze of sweet vapour clings to the air. A robed figure, burlier than you expected, leans over a wooden mash tun, gently stirring a thick, bubbling mix. You can almost feel the warmth radiating from it. This is Brother Arnold, and he's one of the monastery's brewers. He grunts a soft greeting but doesn't look up. His eyes are focused on the temperature of the grain, the sacred alchemy in progress. Monasteries weren't just places of worship. They were microcosms of innovation, discipline, and yes, culinary curiosity. Brewing fit perfectly into that world. It was labour-intensive, required deep patience, and aligned beautifully with the Benedictine motto, ora et labora, pray and work. And monks were nothing if not industrious. Brewing wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. The earliest records of monastic brewing date back to around the 6th century, when Benedict of Nursia founded his monastic rule. He didn't explicitly say, yo, let's make beer, but he did stress hospitality, self-sufficiency and communal meals, all of which encouraged the production of safe, hearty drink, especially when water could literally make you sick. And here's a bit of medieval logic you can appreciate while half dozing. Water might carry disease, but beer, thanks to boiling and fermentation, was way safer. So monks weren't just enjoying a buzz, they were dodging dysentery. Historians still argue whether the monks truly drank beer out of health necessity or more out of habit and culture. Some believe it started out as a safety net, but over time became, shall we say, a very enthusiastic tradition. After all, when you're waking up for midnight prayers and eating porridge 3 times a day, a frothy pint or two becomes a spiritual experience in itself. Now, not every monk was allowed unlimited access to the brewhouse. Brewing was a designated task, much like gardening or scribing, and those selected, like our fictional Brother Arnold here, were highly respected within the cloister. Their recipes were guarded, their brews were tested, refined, and improved over generations. Some monasteries even had tasting protocols. That's right, medieval beer sommeliers, in robes. And before you think this was some rustic backyard operation, remember that by the 9th century, many monasteries had sophisticated systems for malt storage, fermentation, and even rudimentary filtration. They were using wooden spigots, stone fermentation pits, and eventually clay bottling methods that predated corks. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Some monks reportedly added unusual flavourings to their beer, everything from ground ivy and mugwort to, wait for it, chicken blood. No one said holy brewing was always appetising. Back in our warm little brewhouse, Brother Arnold lifts a ladle to his lips and tastes, his eyes close. You watch as he adjusts the flame, stirs again, and murmurs something that might be Latin for not bad. You start to notice that this room isn't just functional, It's sacred. There are tiny wooden carvings tucked into corners, a dusty cross above the door, and a small book bound in cracked leather resting on a shelf. A brewing log, perhaps, or a prayer book. Maybe both. The monks didn't see brewing as separate from their faith. Every part of life was infused with purpose, with ritual, with rhythm. Brew Day wasn't a party, it was a practice, a way to serve others, to maintain health, and to perfect a skill that, in their eyes, mirrored divine order. Balance, patience, transformation. Sounds a lot like spirituality, or really good fermentation. As twilight deepens and the last bells of the day echo through the halls, you imagine the monks filing out of the brew house, each carrying a small cup. They'll drink together at supper, murmuring their final prayers over bowls of lentils and thick slices of dark bread. The beer will be cloudy, a little warm, maybe spiced with yarrow or elderflower, and it will be utterly blessedly satisfying. And tomorrow, they'll do it all again. Brew, chant, pray, repeat. The morning air hits different here. Cool, damp, and just a touch yeasty. You stretch, well, as much as your humble robe allows, and glance at the sky, still caught in that lavender-grey hush before sunrise. Somewhere deep in the cloister, a bell tolls, low and deliberate, shaking the silence like a gentle reminder. Time for matins. You yawn. The monks don't. They've been doing this for years. You shuffle quietly into the chapel, your bare feet whispering across the flagstone, but your mind, like your stomach, is somewhere else. Specifically in the brew house. Again. Because despite the solemn setting, there's no denying the truth. Medieval monks really loved their beer, and not in a casual, maybe one on the weekend kind of way. No, we're talking gallons per week, up to 6 pints per monk per day. And yes, that includes breakfast. That's right. Before you even open your emails, Brother Stefan has knocked back a full tankard of what he lovingly calls breakfast beer. Now don't get it twisted, they weren't hammered all day. Most of the beer was low in alcohol, what's known as small beer, just enough to take the edge off the bitter winter or the equally bitter salted fish served at supper, but still, the sheer volume would baffle most modern livers. So why the obsession? Start with necessity. As mentioned before, water wasn't always safe. Wells could be contaminated, and rivers weren't exactly sparkling with purity. In towns, people sometimes shared water with livestock. Yikes. So beer, boiled, fermented, and often served in clay mugs, was a life-saving hydration plan, with a buzz. Then there was nourishment. Beer wasn't just a drink, it was food, packed with calories, nutrients, and warmth. Liquid bread, they called it. Barley, wheat, oats, all cooked down, fermented, and poured into clay cups. You didn't just drink beer, you practically ate it. Some brews were so thick you could stand a spoon in them, though that might have just been poor filtration, or possibly intentional texture. But the deeper reason monks embraced beer so fully, it fit. Beer aligned with the structure, ritual, and self-sufficiency that defined monastic life, making it required patience, routine, and meticulous cleanliness, qualities monks practiced daily. Brewing wasn't indulgent, it was orderly, holy even. Historians still argue whether monastic beer was originally about sacred labour or sacred loopholes. Was it health preservation wrapped in devotion, or a slow bubbling escape from culinary boredom? Maybe both. Like most medieval habits, it was practical first, spiritual second, and somewhere along the line it got really tasty. You walk past the herb garden, where Brother Thomas is trimming yarrow and sweet gale, early flavourings, long before hops became standard. His sleeves are rolled up. His hands are stained with earth and green. He hums a chant under his breath that somehow sounds suspiciously like a drinking song in Latin. You raise an eyebrow. He winks. And speaking of variety, these monks weren't chugging the same watery mug every day. Far from it. Over centuries, monasteries developed multiple kinds of beer for different purposes, times and audiences. Stronger ales were reserved for feast days or guests, weaker ones for everyday monks. And then there were charity brews, traveller brews, even sick-room beer, gentle nourishing batches made for the ill. Some abbeys even brewed beers with honey, berries or herbs to help with digestion. Or, disguise the taste of a slightly funky batch. One fringe tidbit here, Some abbeys recorded recipes that included strange additions like crushed eggshells or tree bark. Were these medicinal? Accidental? Result of a very bored novice monk? No one knows, but they definitely kept detailed records, in ink, by candlelight. Imagine recipe cards, but written in Latin and chained to the wall. Not all beer tasted great, let's be real. Before sanitation was widely understood, some batches turned sour fast. Others developed what monks euphemistically called the flavour of devotion, a phrase that definitely means tastes like feet. And yet the tradition held. Each sip tied the monks to their community, to their ancestors, and to each other. Beer was a shared experience, a social bond, and a spiritual rhythm. Meals were silent, but the clink of mugs said enough. Monks would sit together at long wooden tables, sipping slowly while a designated reader recited scripture aloud. Some monks, particularly those in higher-ranking abbeys, became so skilled at brewing that word spread beyond monastery walls. Nobles requested their ale, travelling clergy asked for bottles, even the Vatican took notice. Certain abbeys became known not just for their prayers or illuminated manuscripts, but for their flavour profiles. Yes, we're still talking about beer. You stroll into a side chamber now, a cool stone-walled storage room filled with barrels, corked clay jugs and faint hoppy fumes. The air is cooler here, damp, peaceful. A faint drip echoes somewhere, like a metronome for fermentation. You run your hand along the curved wood of a barrel and realise these weren't just kegs. They were symbols of pride, of faith turned liquid, of skill passed down like a sacred chant. By the 11th century, certain abbeys were producing so much beer that they kept 2 or even 3 brewhouses running. One for the monks, one for the poor, one for sale. Beer became not just nourishment, but economy. Still, not every monk could brew. That was a special assignment, a holy calling. Those who did often wore extra layers to ward off the damp. They kept logs, they kept secrets, and let's face it, they probably smelled like sourdough mixed with pine. Not a bad thing, depending on your nose. By now the sun has risen fully. Bells are ringing again. Another prayer hour. Another meal. Another mug. You step out into the courtyard and breathe in the scent of dew and distant hops. Somewhere nearby, Brother Arnold is already preparing the next mash. He doesn't look tired, just focused. A man at peace with yeast. And you? You're not just watching history tonight, you're tasting it. One slow sip at a time. Your feet crunch softly over gravel as you move toward the dining hall, refectory as the monks call it. You're not especially hungry, but curiosity is a good enough excuse to wander. You pass under an arch carved with faded Latin, and the scent hits you. Warm grain, roasted nuts, something slightly fruity, and definitely alcoholic. It's not just breakfast. It's beer o'clock again. Inside, the long wooden tables gleam faintly with candle wax. Wooden bowls hold porridge, dark, crusty bread, and hunks of sharp cheese. But at every seat, beside every set of folded hands, is a mug, some half full already. Because here in the monastery, fasting doesn't always mean nothing. It sometimes means no chewing. Which brings us to tonight's next strange but true truth. Monks didn't just drink beer, they strategically leaned on it to outwit the strict rules of religious fasting. According to the monastic calendar, there were over 100 fasting days a year, some full-on no-meat days, some full-on no-food-at-all days. The body? Expected to persist. But here's the clever part. While chewing meat or bread was forbidden, drinking a hearty, high-calorie beer, technically allowed. Historians still debate whether this was theological loopholing or divine innovation. Some argue the monks sincerely believed beer was liquid bread, and thus acceptable. Others think the rules were bent as far as they'd go without snapping. Either way, the result was a new category of brews, stronger, richer, thicker. Think of it as the medieval version of a protein shake, except with, alcohol. A Bavarian order called the Paulaner monks really took this concept and ran with it. They brewed a special Salvator beer specifically for Lent. It was so dense and bready that even small amounts kept a monk full and upright, mostly. Legend says they even sent a sample to the Pope in Rome to make sure it was allowed. The journey took so long the beer arrived spoiled. The Pope tasted it, gagged, and gave his full approval, assuming no one would actually drink the stuff for pleasure. Joke's on him. You sit now, sipping what passes for breakfast. It's warm, slightly sour, but also oddly comforting, like drinking bread pudding that's gone a little rogue. You look around at the monks, silent in their meals, faces calm. No one's scarfing anything down. Everything is slow, methodical, a meditative chew here, a thoughtful sip there. You catch Brother Hugo giving a quiet thumbs up after his second swallow. Monastic enthusiasm. Now, not all monks brewed fasting beers. Different regions had different customs, and not every order permitted alcohol. The Cistercians were stricter, the Benedictines more liberal, but where beer was allowed, you can bet it was brewed to match the season. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some monasteries named their Lenten beers after saints or virtues, like Patience Ale or Holy Draught. Others just labelled them by strength. You might get a double bock during Holy Week, and a watered-down novice brew the rest of the time. It wasn't quite a party, but it was efficient. And of course, monks weren't the only ones affected by the fasts. Villagers often observed similar restrictions, and in some areas, monasteries brewed and distributed special Lenten beers to local communities. Think of it as a church-sanctioned delivery service, minus the tip jar. You hear a small creak behind you. A door opens. A younger monk carries in another batch of mugs, each one freshly filled. He moves quietly, reverently. You realise these brews weren't just sustenance. They were symbols of discipline, of endurance, and of a kind of holy cleverness that says, we obey the rules, mostly. The balance between sacrifice and satisfaction is delicate here. That's the monastic way. Deny yourself, but also survive. And maybe every now and then, enjoy. The idea that pleasure and piety could coexist. That a well-brewed pint could nourish the body and steady the soul. That was radical, it still is. You wander out again into the cloister walk. Vines trace the stone archways, and bees hum softly over morning blooms. A monk passes you, nodding politely. He carries a small wooden tray with hops laid out to dry. The brew for tomorrow, perhaps, or the next fast. Always planning, always brewing. Historians still discuss whether the Lenten beer tradition was a spiritual adaptation, or just human nature doing its thing. Was it about survival, innovation? Or was it simply the monks realising early on that faith didn't have to taste like deprivation? You step past the brewhouse again and glance through the open shutters. Brother Arnold is still there, wiping down a ladle, humming something that's either a psalm or a very, very old tavern tune. You can't quite tell, but that's sort of the point, isn't it? In a world of rigid rules, beer gave monks a little wiggle room, a little comfort, a little flavour, and a lot of unexpected joy. And joy, even behind thick monastery walls, is very much allowed. You slip out of the cloister garden and follow a stone path winding through the mist. The dew clings to your robes as you descend toward a side building, low, sturdy and warm with the scent of grain and smoke. This, you realise, isn't just a brewhouse. It's a miniature factory, and the monks, they're not just contemplatives, they're innovators. What happens inside these abbey walls doesn't stay here, it travels. By the 10th century, monastic brewing had evolved from a quiet internal habit into something much bigger. Something commercial, even revolutionary. The story tonight takes us beyond the cups of fasting monks, and into the buzzing world where monasteries became the medieval equivalent of beverage empires. It starts small, of course. A little extra beer. A few travellers lodging at the abbey. Maybe a bishop passing through who, between prayers, compliments the local brew with suspiciously worldly enthusiasm. The monks take notice. The recipe is logged, tweaked, improved. Supply grows. Before long, townspeople start showing up at the gates. Not for confession, but for ale. You're standing now at one of those gates. It's not crowded, just a few villagers with clay jugs, waiting patiently for their fill. A monk stands behind a simple wooden counter, ladling out the day's offering with a smile and nod. This isn't just kindness, it's reputation management. The abbey's beer is known, even prized. Some families walk for miles just to get a taste of what's being brewed behind these stone walls. At this point, the monastery has essentially created a brand. Abbeys like St. Gall, Weihenstephan, and Westminster became local centres of brewing knowledge, and their methods spread. Written records from these places show surprising attention to detail. Grain ratios, fermentation times, ideal storage temperatures. It wasn't science yet, but it wasn't far off. Think Excel spreadsheets. Just written in Latin and inked by candlelight. Historians still argue whether these innovations were passed to secular brewers directly or just mimicked over time. Some suggest travelling monks taught nearby villagers the craft. Others believe it was more of an observe and replicate situation. Either way, monastic beer was the blueprint. The taste was better too. While most village brews were inconsistent and sometimes downright foul, think wild yeast and suspicious river water, monastic beer was generally cleaner, stronger and more consistent. Why? Because monks had the time, the discipline, and, let's be honest, the staff. See, a typical monastery wasn't just a few robed guys praying in a circle. It was a self-contained village, often with dozens or even hundreds of residents. Monks, novices, lay brothers, servants, and sometimes even tenant farmers. Brewing was just one job among many, but it was a critical one. That brew house you peeked into earlier, it likely operated every single day. Now imagine scaling that up. Some monasteries built second brew houses just for the public. Others constructed tavern-like outbuildings where travellers and pilgrims could rest, eat, and yes, drink. A few even charged for premium brews, which helped fund everything from repairs to charity. One quirky tidbit. In parts of England and France, monastic breweries marked their barrels not with words, but with tiny carved icons. Sheep for strong ale, a star for mild, a fish for fasting beer. You had to know the symbols to get the good stuff, like medieval craft beer labels, only with fewer puns. You step into a cool storage chamber now, row after row of stacked barrels, some gently seeping, others wax sealed and dated with careful notches. A monk named Brother Leontius is inspecting them. He taps one with a wooden mallet, listens, then nods solemnly, as if the barrel just passed confession. These barrels aren't for the monks' dinner tonight. They're headed to a town market or perhaps downriver to a nearby priory. The beer is currency now, influence in liquid form. As brewing spread, so did competition. Secular brewers began to copy monastic styles. Some succeeded, others just slapped abbey style on their wares, hoping no one noticed the taste difference. A few monasteries even had to defend their brewing rights, citing charters and holy precedent to keep local lords from taxing or banning their beer. And let's not forget the pilgrims. By the 12th century, religious travel was booming. Roads teemed with dusty boots and tired feet, and pilgrims needed food, shelter, and yes, refreshment. Monasteries offered all three. Many set up dedicated guest houses with small taverns or pilgrim halls, complete with long benches, hearty stews, and frothy mugs. You sit at one now. A wooden tray is placed in front of you. A bowl of lentil pottage, a hunk of dark rye bread, and a pewter cup filled to the brim with a mild, cloudy ale. It smells faintly of apples and toasted grain. As you sip, the warmth blooms slowly, soothing your limbs, easing your thoughts. It's no wonder these places thrived. And yet, with all this expansion, the monks still insisted on discipline. Each batch was tasted, logged, prayed over. Brewing remained a sacred duty, even as it became an economic force. Historians still debate how much profit these breweries made. Most monasteries weren't rolling in gold, but they weren't broke either. The income from beer-funded hospitals, schools, libraries and shelters. In that sense, drinking was charitable. By the time you finish your meal, the dining hall is filled with a soft murmur. Travellers lean in close, sharing stories of long roads, strange visions and near misses with bandits. The monks serve quietly, moving like shadows with trays of beer and bread. No one raises a voice, no one hurries. It's hospitality wrapped in ritual. Outside, twilight creeps again, and somewhere behind the chapel the brewhouse chimney exhales a thin ribbon of smoke. Another batch is already underway. You wake up to the soft clang of iron on stone. No alarm clock, just a monk hammering something useful in the courtyard. The air is crisp, the kind that makes your lungs tingle. Somewhere nearby bread is baking, and further off, yes, that faintly sweet scent again. Malt, always malt. Today, your path winds through a quieter part of the abbey. Less chant, more clatter. You follow the sound of wooden paddles stirring thick mash and bubbling brews, and as you step inside the brewhouse again, you realise something remarkable. This whole operation runs like clockwork. Because that's what monastic life is. Clockwork. Welcome to the Benedictine rule. Part scripture, part schedule, four-part productivity manifesto. Drafted by St. Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, this little rulebook guided monastic life for centuries, and it turns out it's the secret sauce behind why monks became such excellent brewers. Under the rule, everything has a time: wake, pray, work, eat, pray again, sleep, repeat. It's a rhythm, a hum, like a heartbeat behind the stone walls. And brewing? It fits perfectly. Brewing beer isn't a one-and-done task. It's a multi-day process that requires careful attention at just the right intervals. You glance at the wall inside the brewhouse. There's no fancy clock, of course, but there is a sundial and a candle marked with wax lines for timekeeping. Brother Arnold is already at work. He's watching the temperature of the mash with the precision of a surgeon. He doesn't need a thermometer. He knows when it's right because he's done it every Thursday for 15 years. Monks didn't invent beer, but they organised it. They brought it into harmony with prayer, labour, and rest. In the outside world, brewers had to fit beer-making around unpredictable lives. Storms, taxes, neighbours who borrowed your fermenting bucket and didn't return it. But inside the abbey, brewing had a home on the schedule, right between mid-morning prayers and tending the vegetable garden. And it wasn't just the schedule, it was the space. You step through the brewing complex now, it's more elaborate than you'd expect. There's the malt house where barley is soaked and sprouted. A drying room, smoky and warm, where the grains take on a roasted flavour. Then the brew house itself, with its massive copper kettles and stone hearths. And finally the cellar, cool, dark and earthy. Each space has its purpose, each task its hour. Historians still argue whether the average monk fully understood fermentation or just learned by repetition. Some believe they stumbled into good practices, like not disturbing the ale too early, without understanding the microbiology behind it. Others credit monastic notebooks for laying the foundation of early brewing science. Either way it worked. And cleanliness? Don't underestimate medieval monks. They might not have had germ theory, but they understood that clean tools made better beer. Monks regularly scrubbed kettles with salt and boiling water. They filtered beer through cloth or straw. Some even added resin or wax to barrels to prevent leaks and spoilage. It was a full-on sanitation system centuries before Louis Pasteur started preaching about microbes. Here's your fringe fact for this batch. Some monks even trained their noses to detect fermentation issues. A good batch had a soft, almost bready aroma. A bad one, sour, sharp, or worse, rotten cabbage. One whiff and Brother Bernard knew whether the yeast was happy or having a meltdown. You lean over a tun and inhale. It smells warm, earthy, slightly sweet, definitely better than cabbage. Now picture this. You're a monk, and you know it's going to be a brew day. You rise before dawn, attend matins, then head straight to the malt house. You stir the soaking grains, then pray at Lauds. You come back, drain the mash, light the hearth, and begin boiling. You slip away to terse, then return to stir again. It continues all day in sync with the monastic bells. It's not just work, it's ritual, and that rhythm, the one that ruled their lives, made the beer better. Reliable, predictable, safe. While peasant brewers might rush a batch or lose track of time, monks brewed with almost machine-like precision. Even feast days had their own brewing cues. Easter, stronger beer. Pentecost, add herbs. Saints' days, honey if you had it. And fasting seasons, of course, demanded the extra thick, high-calorie liquid bread we've already sipped. Some abbeys even created seasonal rotation schedules. 1 week for brewing, 1 for baking, 1 for scribing. Round and round it went. Labour balanced by prayer, spiritual goals anchored by very practical tasks. And because of this structure, monks could spend decades perfecting their beer, adjusting grain quantities, timing fermentations to the hour, experimenting with water sources. Some even journaled results like tiny lab scientists. Mash too hot, flavour thin. Boil longer next time. Novice left the mash tun uncovered. Flies. Always improving, always brewing. Historians still debate whether this monastic method spread to secular breweries by osmosis or by direct teaching. Either way, the modern brewing process owes a deep, foamy debt to men in robes who never missed a bell. As the sun climbs higher, the brewhouse warms. Brother Arnold wipes his hands and nods to you. Another batch nearly ready. Another prayer whispered. Another day aligned with work and wonder. You head outside, blinking in the sunlight, and hear the distant toll of the midday bell. Time to eat, time to pray. And maybe, just maybe, time for a little celebratory sip. Because when you live by the rule, even beer can be holy. The sun stands directly overhead now, casting long shadows between the cloister arches. You walk the perimeter slowly, letting your fingertips trail across the cool stone walls. A breeze stirs through the courtyard, and somewhere a lute plays. Light, irregular plucks from a novice too new to realise the monks like their music either silent or very, very competent. You smile, but your feet lead you back toward the brewhouse again. There's a pull here, not just the smell, though yes, the blend of malt, smoke and yeast is oddly magnetic, but something else. A sense of hidden knowledge. Because even though they didn't know about yeast as a microbe, medieval monks were not just brewers, they were inventors. Inside, Brother Arnold is fussing over a line of barrels, but today he's not alone. Another monk stands beside him, shorter, leaner, with spectacles pinching the bridge of his nose like they're there to keep him grounded in reality. This is Brother Remigius. He's what we'd call the monastery's science guy. If it bubbles, burns, or ferments, he's interested. You slip inside quietly, watching as he holds a small scrap of linen over the open lip of a fermenting tune. He sniffs, frowns, jots something in a tiny book. No one told him to do this. It's just what he does. See, brewing required observation, consistency, patience, all of which monks had in spades. And over time they developed practical systems for measuring, predicting, and refining their beer, not through modern chemistry, but through sheer stubborn trial and error. Brother Remigius lifts a slender stick marked with carved notches, an early hydrometer of sorts. It floats briefly, dips, then steadies. He nods. This batch is fermenting well. It's little things like this that hint at just how sophisticated monastic brewing became. While peasants still crossed their fingers and hoped the ale gods were in a good mood, monks tracked changes. They recorded how long a mash sat before spoiling. They noticed which barrels leaked and which grains absorbed more water. Some even noted the effects of moon phases, not necessarily because they were superstitious, but because they watched. Historians still argue whether monks genuinely believed in astrological brewing effects, or if that was just the era's default explanation for natural cycles. Either way, these observations led to improvements: better fermentation timing, more effective cooling, smarter storage. And cleanliness? Monks took it to another level. Before Louis Pasteur discovered that heat could kill microbes, monks were already boiling their wort, partly to concentrate the sugars, but also because, quite by accident, it made the beer safer. They rinsed barrels with scalding water. Some even steeped wooden tools in brine or vinegar between batches. Why? Because batches that came after tended to turn out better. Coincidence? Maybe. But monks didn't care, they just did it again. Here's your quirky tidbit. In one 12th century abbey, a monk was reprimanded for using blessed water to scrub out beer barrels. Not because it was sacrilegious, but because it made the beer taste funny. Priorities. You move to a long workbench now, where Brother Remigius has several open scrolls and what looks like a barrel cross-section carved in wood. He's been experimenting with different stave angles, trying to determine which geometry holds pressure best. Overkill? Maybe. But remember, this is his life's work. Beer isn't just a drink, it's a calling. Atop the scrolls is a dried sprig of something floral, maybe heather or sweet gale. Monks often experimented with herbs to see which added flavour, which reduced spoilage, and which caused, let's say, unexpected side effects. There are records of sleepy beer, laughing beer, and even dream beer, allegedly given to monks suffering from nightmares. We'll never know the exact recipes, but judging by some notes in the margins, one of them involved wild poppy. Bold choice. You lean in closer and catch a glimpse of something even stranger. A faded drawing of yeast sediment, annotated with phrases like spirit of the beer and white crown of life. They didn't know yeast as we do, but they recognised its behaviour. It was alive, temperamental, holy. And yeast wasn't the only mystery they poked at. Some monks discovered that covering fermenting vats with damp cloths sped up the process. Others noted that certain types of wood seemed to bless the flavour more than others. Beech versus oak, for example. A few abbeys even planted specific trees near the brewhouse, believing the wood's character influenced the batch. Whether that's science or wishful thinking, historians are still undecided. One particularly curious friar, documented in a dusty side note, tried brewing with cold river stones added during fermentation. The logic? Stone has memory. The result? Well, apparently not delicious, but points for creativity. That's the thing. While monks weren't scientists in the modern sense, they were deeply curious, and their environment gave them something rare: time. No customers screaming for faster delivery, no shareholders demanding cost cuts, just time, silence, and the slow loop of prayer and practice. So over generations, monasteries became quiet hubs of innovation. The brewhouse was a lab, the recipes were blueprints, the mistakes became lessons, and the results? Some of the finest beer in Europe. You sit down on a low bench as Brother Remigius offers you a small clay cup. It's a test batch, he explains. A little sour but clean. You sip. It's tart at first, then mellow, with a hint of something herbal. Behind you, Brother Arnold chuckles. Apparently he wasn't a fan. You thank them both and step back outside into the fresh air, brain buzzing lightly. Not from alcohol, but from the sheer ingenuity you've just witnessed. And as you walk, you realise this isn't just about monks making beer. It's about monks quietly changing the world, one pint at a time. You walk slowly now, letting the cool air soothe your skin. The sun has slipped behind a patch of grey clouds, casting soft light across the monastery grounds. Everything smells damp and alive, like stone, earth, and faintly of smoke from the brewhouse chimney. But there's another scent here, subtler, almost invisible unless you're really paying attention. It's water. Not just the clean mountain stream kind, but the questionable variety. And this, dear sleepy traveller, is where we dig into the part nobody really likes to talk about, the medieval water problem. You follow the curve of the monastery wall toward a narrow channel that trickles lazily through the garden. It looks peaceful, like something you'd dip your toes into while contemplating the Psalms. But back in the day, this gentle stream might have been hiding more danger than any battlefield. See, in the medieval world, clean water wasn't easy to come by. Wells could be tainted by runoff. Rivers were communal, used for washing, drinking, and yes, disposing of things you didn't want to deal with later. You can picture the issue already. Peasants drawing buckets downstream from where someone had just lightened the load. Not great for hydration, worse for health. Even in monasteries, supposed centres of order and discipline, there were sanitation blind spots. Latrines often emptied into moats or channels that eventually mingled with the very water sources meant for cooking or bathing. It's no wonder illnesses spread like wildfire. Which brings us back to beer. You stop at a stone basin where a young monk is drawing water. He fills a wooden pail and walks it over to the brewhouse, not for drinking but for boiling. Because boiling water was key. Brewing required heating the mash to high temperatures, then fermenting it in clean, hopefully clean containers. The process killed off most harmful bacteria, accidentally of course, but effectively. Historians still debate whether monks understood why their beer was safer than water, or if they just chalked it up to divine providence. Some argue the improved hygiene was intentional, others say it was just a lucky byproduct of the brewing process. Either way it worked, and people noticed. Travellers, for instance, often preferred beer to water when passing through unfamiliar regions. Pilgrims stopping at abbeys were given bread, soup, and beer, not out of generosity alone, but because beer was simply safer. It kept them alive to reach the next shrine. Even children drank beer, though not the strong kind. Small beer was diluted, mildly fermented, and packed just enough calories to count as a meal in a mug. Toddlers sipped it. Grannies loved it. Monks drank it like it was the 13th century version of Gatorade. And while beer may not have cured diseases, it did prevent a lot of them. Diarrheal illnesses were rampant in medieval towns, but far less so in communities that drank more beer than water. Monasteries, particularly the well-organised ones, were healthier, not just because of prayer or isolation, but because of their brew. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some abbeys kept water only for washing, cooking porridge and feeding livestock, not for drinking. They even marked jugs with wax seals or carved symbols to avoid mix-ups. Rumour has it that in one particularly strict order, a novice was once assigned to test the water by taste, and promptly reassigned to kitchen duty when he got the runs. Practical monks, harsh lessons. As you turn a corner, you spot a set of stone pipes embedded in the wall. They lead toward the brew hall. Aqueducts of a sort, early plumbing that helped channel spring water away from contaminated sources. Monks were among the few with the means and discipline to build such systems, and while the engineering wasn't perfect, it was a huge step above the average village mud puddle. Some monasteries went even further, setting up 2 water systems, one for clean tasks like brewing and cooking, and another for unclean tasks like washing laundry or, let's say, human offloading. These weren't modern sanitation systems, but they were an early attempt to separate clean from filthy. And in the 12th century, that was borderline genius. You pass the kitchen next. A monk is pouring small beer into clay jugs for the midday meal. He notices you and smiles, just a twitch at the corner of his mouth, like he's about to offer you a pint, but then remembers you're probably here for penance, not pleasure. You wink anyway. Monastic rules may be strict, but they don't outlaw cheekiness, and that's the thing. Beer wasn't just part of monastic life, it protected it. The abbey's survival depended not just on prayers and herbs, but on something as humble as a wooden barrel and a bubbling tun. Monks got to live longer, healthier lives, in part because they drank beer instead of the medieval version of mystery juice. And they didn't just hoard that knowledge, they shared it. Quietly, generously, one mug at a time. You pause now at a shaded bench near the garden wall. Overhead, birds flit between trees. The breeze carries a trace of that familiar scent, earth, grain, and a hint of hop. You take a deep breath, and suddenly the silence feels full, peaceful, like the world is still spinning, just a little slower. And in that moment, you realise, monks didn't just brew to drink, they brewed to survive. You hear it before you see it, the slow creak of a cart, the shuffle of bare feet, and the low murmur of voices coming from the outer gate. You follow the sound, stepping through a side door into the abbey courtyard where a small crowd has gathered. Villagers, travellers, one old woman balancing a sack of onions, a child holding a chipped jug, all waiting patiently for the same thing. Beer. Not for celebration, not for indulgence, for survival. Because tonight, you're watching monks do something that doesn't make the history books as often as it should. They're giving it away. While the world outside the abbey often brewed beer to sell or drink privately, monks did something different. They brewed as charity. At many monasteries, one part of the beer was always set aside for the poor, for pilgrims too tired to walk another step, for sick strangers who arrived at the gate weak, feverish, and famished. You watch as Brother Hugo, round and red-cheeked, fills a clay mug and hands it gently to a bent old man. No words, just the universal language of kindness in fermented form. It wasn't fancy beer. Often it was small beer, the lowest strength. But it was safe, filling, and brewed with care. Charity was baked into monastic life. According to the rule of St. Benedict, hospitality wasn't optional, it was holy. All guests who present themselves are to be welcomed as Christ, the rule says. And in the 12th century, if Christ showed up tired and coughing, the first thing he got was probably beer. You watch the monks moving smoothly through the crowd, offering bread, soup, and mugs. No fanfare, just service. And when they run out of jugs, they switch to pouring directly into hands or travellers' own containers. One woman offers a small coin. Brother Hugo waves it away with a shrug. "Drink," he says. "Rest." Here's your quirky tidbit of the evening. Some monasteries went so far as to create dedicated beer almonries, little side halls attached to the abbey, just for handing out beer to the needy. They had benches, sometimes straw bedding, and a rotating pot of thick stew if you were lucky. If you were really lucky, you might get to taste the monk's stronger brew, usually only served to nobles or high-ranking guests. Historians still argue whether this generosity was purely altruistic or also strategic. After all, monasteries needed goodwill. A local community that loved you was more likely to protect you and less likely to accidentally set your grain stores on fire. Others argue the monks simply practiced what they preached. Feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, even if it meant sacrificing a few barrels of your best. Not all monasteries were equally charitable. Some were more focused on profit. But in the more devout orders, the brewing for others wasn't just a side job, it was a sacred responsibility. Brewing as almsgiving, brewing as prayer. You follow a monk now into a small side building, quieter than the main brewhouse. The scent here is gentler, less overpowering. A small batch is fermenting in wooden tubs. This is the charity batch. Lower grain ratio, less hops, shorter boil, but no less care. Brother Matthias stirs the mash slowly, lips moving in silent prayer. You notice he's marked the barrel not with a symbol of strength or flavour, but a tiny carved cross. Sometimes, you learn, monks even brewed beer specifically for hospitals. Infirmaries attached to abbeys often used beer as both nourishment and treatment, especially when patients couldn't stomach solid food. Weak beer was mixed with herbs like mint, chamomile or sage. It wasn't a cure-all, but it helped. A little hydration, a little comfort, a little dignity in a world that didn't offer much of it. You sit now in a corner of the almonry, watching the light filter through slatted shutters. A man next to you drinks slowly with both hands around the mug. He's not a monk, just a labourer perhaps, one of many who knows that this place, this quiet, cloistered place, will never turn him away thirsty. It's easy to romanticize it, to picture the monks as gentle bearded heroes handing out foam-topped miracles. But the reality was more grounded, and in some ways, more beautiful. They brewed beer because people needed it, because the world was hard, because when someone's hungry you don't give them a sermon, you give them something warm and heavy that fills the belly and calms the nerves. Some monks went further. They set up rotating brew shifts just for alms batches. Others kept a secret store of higher calorie beer just for the sickest visitors. One record even tells of a monk named Aelred who smuggled stronger ale into a plague-ridden village by hiding it in hollowed-out bread loaves. Risky? Yes, but compassionate? Absolutely. Back outside, the last of the crowd is dispersing. Empty jugs slosh with fresh brew. Children skip beside tired mothers, and Brother Hugo wipes his hands on his robe, face flushed from heat and goodwill. He turns to you and says simply, "We brew so others may rest." There's a silence after that. Not awkward, just full. And as you stand there, watching the last few villagers head down the road, you realise that for monks, brewing wasn't just a science or a business or even a pleasure. It was love, poured one humble cup at a time. The light slants golden across the monastery walls now. Late afternoon, a quiet time. Prayer bells have not yet rung, and the cloister walks are still, save for the occasional flutter of a bird nesting in the rafters. You find yourself back in the brewhouse, but today there's a different energy, not the usual order and rhythm of grain and fire. No, this batch is strange, fragrant in ways that make your nose twitch, a little floral, a little medicinal, and decidedly not the standard earthy bitterness you've grown used to. You raise an eyebrow. Brother Remigius nods toward a small table cluttered with linen pouches and dried sprigs. "We're experimenting," he says, like a medieval craft brewer about to change the game, or start a fire. Because tonight, you dive into the tangled world of pre-hop beer, where monks used herbs, flowers, and more than a few questionable ingredients to flavour their brews long before hops became king. Let's start with the basics. Hops, the cone-like flowers of the humulus lupulus plant, weren't always standard in beer. In fact, for centuries, brews were seasoned with an ever-shifting mix of herbs known collectively as gruit. It was wild, unpredictable, and often depended on what grew nearby. You lean in to examine a few of the ingredients: mugwort, yarrow, heather, sweet gale. All dried, bundled, and smelling like a witch's pantry or a fancy organic tea aisle. Each added flavour, aroma, and occasionally a touch of natural preservative. Some, like bog myrtle, gave beer a piney sharpness. Others, like wild rosemary, gave it a mouth-numbing astringency that frankly might have been better suited to a dentist's office. Historians still argue whether gruit beers were more flavourful than modern hopped ales, or simply more chaotic. Some claim the herbal combinations were subtle and refined. Others say drinking gruit was like chugging soup made by someone who hates you. Honestly, both can be true depending on who was brewing. You sip cautiously from a clay mug Brother Remigius offers. The brew is cloudy, golden, with a strange peppery tickle. It tastes like bread that was rolled through a meadow. Not terrible, just surprising. The aftertaste lingers, floral and slightly bitter. Before hops came along, monks often guarded their gruit recipes like holy relics. Each abbey had its own secret blend. Some included tree bark, others a dash of honey or crushed berries. One especially ambitious monastery even tried dried orange peel, likely imported by traders from the south. Very fancy, very expensive, very orange. And then there were the truly odd additions. Your quirky tidbit tonight? In one 13th century recipe discovered in the margins of a monastic brewing manual, a monk notes, "Add the powder of eggshell for foam." Whether this actually worked or just made the beer taste like regret, we'll never know. But it shows the monks were not afraid to get weird with it. There were also spiritual herbs, plants believed to drive out demons or calm unruly thoughts. St. John's wort, for example, was sometimes steeped into the brew for its supposed power against melancholy. Monks didn't just want good beer, they wanted morally upright beer, the kind you could drink and still feel holy. Eventually, of course, hops made their entrance. Likely popularised by Germanic brewers in the early 11th century, hops were found to offer a triple benefit: bitterness to balance the malt's sweetness, antimicrobial properties to lengthen shelf life, and a flavour profile that, if managed well, didn't taste like a potion gone wrong. But not everyone was excited. You walk with Brother Arnold now through the storage room, where he pauses at a small faded scroll pinned beside the door. On it is a list of ingredients, many of them now crossed out. Transition list, he calls it. The point when hops began to replace Groot. A slow, sometimes reluctant shift. Some monks resisted, arguing that hops made beer taste too sharp, too worldly, too German, and in truth, early hopped beers were a departure. Sharper, more bitter, less like soup, more like, well, beer as we know it today. Hops tamed the wildness of Groot, standardized the flavour, made things easier to store and sell. Still, there's something charming about those older batches. Those unpredictable, herbal, sometimes over-flavoured concoctions. They reflected the land, the season, the brewer's mood, a little chaos in every cup. And some monks never gave them up. You peek into a back room now, a kind of monastic apothecary. Dried herbs hang from rafters, wooden bowls hold crushed flowers. Brother Remigius gently opens a jar labelled Trial 27. You lean in, it smells like licorice, mint, and burnt grass. He grins. Not all experiments succeed, and yet they keep trying. Even now, in modern Trappist breweries, monks occasionally blend small batch herb-infused beers, reviving old recipes, celebrating forgotten flavours. Groot isn't gone, it's just waiting. As evening settles in, you sip once more from your herbal mug. The bitterness is gentler than hops, softer on the tongue. The warmth spreads, not fast but steady. It's a different kind of buzz, a slower comfort, a reminder that brewing, like faith, doesn't have to follow one recipe. It can be earthy, imperfect, wild, and still entirely sacred. It's dusk now, and the sky has turned that deep medieval blue, the colour of old prayer books and cold ink. A breeze swirls past the abbey walls, carrying with it the rich scent of roasting grain and wood smoke. You find yourself once again standing at the edge of the main gate, only this time there's movement. A slow procession. Dusty boots, walking staffs, rosary beads clinking softly. These are pilgrims, some old, some young, some limping a little too dramatically, but all clearly on a mission. They approach the monastery like it's a sacred oasis, and to many it is. Because tonight you're watching faith and fermentation collide at full speed. Pilgrimages weren't just spiritual marathons, they were logistical nightmares. You had to walk, sometimes hundreds of miles, over uneven roads, through unpredictable weather, past thieves, and always with your stomach rumbling. But monasteries made it survivable. They were safe stops on the long road to relics and redemption. And what did the weary pilgrim need most after a week of walking and soul-searching? Beer. Always beer. You watch as Brother Hugo leads the travellers to the guest hall, where bowls of lentil stew and slices of cheese await. But it's the mugs that cause the real stir. Pilgrims smile, their shoulders drop. Even their prayers sound less panicked now that they're clutching something foamy and familiar. It wasn't just generosity. Monasteries planned for this. Many brewed extra beer specifically for pilgrim season. Stronger batches, tastier batches, sometimes even flavoured with honey or herbs to make a memorable impression. A satisfied pilgrim, the medieval version of 5-star word-of-mouth marketing. You follow the procession inside, where a long wooden table gleams with flickering candlelight. It's loud in here. Not like a tavern exactly. More like a very devout wedding reception where everyone forgot the music but remembered the beer. Conversations flow. One woman shares a miracle story from her last stop. A bearded man tries to sell hand-drawn relic maps. Someone's quietly weeping into their stew. No one asks why. And through it all, the monks keep the mugs full. Monasteries didn't charge pilgrims for beer, at least not openly, but there were donation boxes, and pilgrims, grateful and perhaps slightly buzzed, were often quite generous. Coins dropped into coffers helped keep the lights on, or more accurately the candles lit. Historians still argue whether this exchange, beer for alms, was sacred hospitality or clever economic strategy. Some believe monks genuinely saw it as a divine duty. Others suggest abbots quickly realised the financial upside, probably both. Medieval monks were holy, but they weren't naive. You move to a side table where Brother Leontius is quietly setting out pewter mugs engraved with tiny symbols, crosses, vines, stars. He explains that different monasteries use different marks to distinguish batches. Some even developed early branding, so pilgrims who loved a particular brew would remember the symbol and seek it out again. And that brings us to a curious consequence. Beer tourism. That's right. Some pilgrims started planning routes based on the reputation of a monastery's ale. Oh yes, I'm definitely seeking spiritual renewal, they'd say, right after a stop at St. Foamy's for 2 pints and a blessed nap. Can you blame them? One quirky tidbit. A 14th century English monk complained in his journal that certain pilgrims skipped morning mass but never missed evening ale. He added passive-aggressively, "They seem to have confused the Holy Spirit with spirits." You sip a sample now, rich, golden, surprisingly fruity. This batch was clearly made for guests, not daily consumption. A little extra sugar in the mash, perhaps. You detect a note of elderflower. Fancy. Pilgrims earned it. And the brew house? It's booming. You take a walk with Brother Arnold past a small outbuilding near the gate. It looks almost like a tavern, a separate brew hall with benches, a fire pit, and space for large groups. This was common in larger monasteries. Brewed inside the abbey, served just outside the walls. That way, the sacred rhythm inside wasn't disturbed by too much festivity. These satellite alehouses became important gathering places, not just for pilgrims, but for locals, merchants, even messengers. News was shared, deals were struck. One monk was said to have brokered a truce between feuding villages over mugs of winter ale. Diplomacy, medieval style. Some monasteries took it even further, packaging their beer in wooden flasks for pilgrims to carry along the road. Holy bottles, they were sometimes called, sealed with wax, stamped with the abbey's mark, and occasionally sold in towns for a tidy donation. They were the medieval version of growlers, though definitely harder to recycle. And the more the beer travelled, the more famous the abbey became. You pass a wall near the guest house where a faded map hangs. Pilgrimage routes crisscross Europe with tiny monastery icons marked in red. Some have tiny chalices drawn beside them. You realise these weren't just spiritual routes, they were beer trails. The dual nature of the pilgrimage stop, sanctuary and alehouse, made monasteries indispensable. They kept travellers alive, spiritually and physically. They made the road bearable. They made the beer memorable. As the night deepens and the pilgrims settle into their straw mattresses, the guest hall grows quiet. A few late drinkers linger by the fire, nursing their final sips and whispering tales of holy visions or suspicious cheese. You step outside. The moon is out now, casting pale light over the abbey walls. The air smells of ash, bread, and just a hint of barley. And you think, for all their prayers, the monks understood something profound. Sometimes the holiest thing you can do for a weary soul is offer them a place to sit and something warm to drink. The night hangs heavy now, soft and solemn. Only a few lanterns flicker in the cloister corridors, their light pooling gold across the flagstones. Somewhere in the dark a nightingale sings. The monastery has gone quiet, save for the distant bubbling of a fresh brew, still gently fermenting beneath the timbered roof. You find yourself slipping through a narrow stone doorway near the scriptorium, the abbey's writing room, where monks spend long hours hunched over parchment, copying texts with meticulous care. But tonight you're not here for prayers or psalms, you're here for recipes. Tucked away in the corners of dusty manuscripts, Often scribbled in margins or tucked between litanies and feast day calendars lie the brewing secrets of the monks, forgotten ink, hidden formulas, tiny bubbles trapped between lines of Latin. Because while the brewhouse was the engine of flavour, this scriptorium was its library. Brother Matthias, who smells faintly of old ink and crushed lavender, beckons you toward a wooden chest beneath a long desk. He opens it reverently. Inside are scrolls and leather-bound books, faded but still intact. Some are simple, just lists of ingredients and ratios. Others are like spells, brew times, fermentation notes, advice on barley moisture and yeast behaviour, written with the intensity of divine revelation. You gently unroll one. The Latin is precise, neat. Next to a verse from Proverbs, there's a hand-drawn diagram of a mash tun. The ink here is darker, more recent. Someone added a note in the margins. Longer boil. Too sour last lent no signature. Just the quiet echo of a monk with opinions. These weren't random kitchen notes. These were sacred texts of a different kind. In fact, some abbeys created entire brewing codices, handwritten manuals passed down through generations of monk brewers. The best ones were chained to shelves like other precious books, not out of superstition, but because they were valuable. You didn't want some novice accidentally dropping your 80-gallon barley formula into the cloister fountain. And what's wild is, many of these formulas still exist. Historians and modern brewers have pored over old monastic documents from places like St. Gall in Switzerland or Grimbergen in Belgium, carefully translating, interpreting, and even recreating ancient beers using modern equipment. Some ingredients are easy enough: barley, wheat, oats, water. Others are a little more interpretive, like a handful of sweetwood, possibly licorice root, 2 kisses of wormwood, or, our quirky gem of the night, the breath of summer air stirred through the mash before prayer, which might be poetic, or might be code for open the window. You leaf through another manuscript. This one's been lovingly illuminated, its margins decorated with tiny hop vines curling between verses. That alone is a historical marker. Hops, once controversial, eventually became a point of pride. Monks didn't just accept them, they celebrated them. Brother Matthias whispers that some abbeys even held brewing competitions. Not publicly, of course, but in quiet, monkish ways. Whoever brewed the best for Easter feast got to choose the hymn at Vespers, he says with a wink. Sacred incentives. Not all scrolls are well preserved. Some have mildew, others water stains from long-forgotten cellar floods. One has claw marks, possibly a rat, possibly divine punishment for an especially bad batch. No one's quite sure, but the survival of these documents is remarkable, and now, in modern times, some monasteries are resurrecting them. You sit with Brother Matthias as he shows you a newer book. Fresh parchment, clean ink, careful calligraphy. It's a modern copy of the oldest brewing scroll from this abbey. Not just preserved, but translated into something the current generation can use. A way to keep the past bubbling into the present. Some Trappist monasteries today still use centuries-old recipes. Chimay, Orval, Westvleteren. The beers they bottle and sell aren't just drinks. They're history in a glass, made with techniques that date back to these very scrolls, copied and recopied by steady monk hands in the quiet hours of the night. Historians still argue about how accurate these modern recreations are. After all, medieval units of measurement weren't exactly precise. A fist of grain. Whose fist? A song-long boil? Whose song? The ambiguities are part of the charm and the challenge. But no one disputes the devotion, the patient record-keeping, the desire to make something not just delicious but lasting. And it wasn't just monks who studied these recipes. Noble families, wandering clerics, even rival brewers would sometimes copy down fragments, bits of monastic wisdom passed from one scribe's hand to another. Like yeast, knowledge spread quietly. You lean over the desk now and copy a line for yourself. Let no brew be poured until it has slept a week, and let it rest in silence, for silence is the brewer's friend. You smile. The candle burns lower, and the room darkens further. Outside, the wind stirs. Somewhere, a barrel creaks. And inside this little room of ink and secrets, you realise, the monks weren't just preserving scripture, they were preserving flavour. The next morning arrives with a gentle drizzle, just enough to slick the stone paths and send a few hooded monks trudging faster between buildings. You walk slowly, savouring the quiet, the earthy smell of damp soil, and the comforting hiss of rain on roof tiles. The abbey, as always, continues. Orderly, measured, prayerful. But let's not pretend every monk stayed so saintly. Today we peek behind the curtain at the less than holy habits of some medieval monks, especially when it came to the beer they brewed, sampled, and sometimes oversampled. Not every monk lived like a brewing angel. In fact, some of them got a little too cosy with their creations. Because when you've got constant access to beer, and your days are built around repetitive work, early mornings, and the occasional mind-numbing sermon on the importance of humility, it's not shocking that a few friars started getting creative with how much tasting they were doing. You find yourself in the abbey's cellar now. A cool, vaulted space beneath the main hall. Wooden barrels line the walls, some are sealed tight, others marked with chalked symbols that look suspiciously like medieval smiley faces. A monk named Brother Conrad is here today. He's wiping his hands on a cloth that's seen more spills than blessings, and he raises an eyebrow when he sees you poking around the corner. "You didn't hear it from me," he says, in the exact tone of someone who's about to tell you everything. But Brother Eustace once fell asleep in the cask room after testing for quality. Twice. Ah, yes. The age-old brewer's excuse, quality control. There are records, plenty of them, of monks overindulging in their own stock. One 14th century abbot even wrote a stern letter to his entire order, reminding them that tasting is not supping, and supping is not slumbering under the table. That's pretty direct for a guy who also wrote sermons about the importance of patience. Historians still argue how widespread monastic overdrinking was. Some claim it was isolated, the occasional bad apple cider. Others believe it was common enough that most monasteries eventually introduced strict rules about when and how often monks could access the brewhouse. In some places, locks were installed. In others, brewing duties rotated to prevent too much familiarity, because apparently familiarity brewed contempt, or at least tipsiness. And then there's the branding issue. Not branding as in iron on symbols, no medieval monks were tagging cows with beer logos, but branding in the marketing sense. Because when beer became not just sustenance, but a source of income, some monasteries started getting very creative with how they advertised their ale. You walk through a small cloister corridor now, and notice a series of painted wooden signs, reproductions of old abbey emblems. One features St. Benedict holding a mug, another shows a foamy cup next to a shining cross, and one, bizarrely, has a cartoon donkey, smiling beneath the words, "Miracle Brew." You raise an eyebrow. Brother Conrad shrugs. Pilgrims like a bit of flair. Indeed they did. Some monasteries leaned into the reputation. They named their beer after saints, virtues, and biblical events. Resurrection Ale, Holy Friday Stout, Blessed Bitter. Some included subtle boasts in their labelling like, as poured at the foot of St. Mary's altar, which sounded holy, but definitely implied, "Our beer is good enough for heaven," one quirky tidbit from the era. A monastery in what's now Belgium once labelled its beer God's favourite. When asked by a suspicious bishop how they knew this, the abbot reportedly replied, "Because he hasn't struck the barrels yet." Clever, risky, definitely pushing it. But that's what makes this part of the story so human. Beneath the layers of piety and prayer, the monks were just people. People who worked hard, got bored, and occasionally wanted to make their brothers laugh with a cheeky label or a too generous pour. You follow Brother Conrad into a smaller cellar room, where a half-empty cask leans against the wall. "Test batch," he mutters. "Too strong for daily use." He pours you a sip anyway. You take it, and wow. It hits like a sermon and a fistfight all at once. It's fruity, spicy, warming, and borderline dangerous. "This one never leaves the abbey," Conrad smirks. "We call it the abbot's nap," he winks. 2 cups, and you understand why. And therein lies the monastic dilemma. How do you balance devotion with fermentation? Some abbots laid down firm rules. No brewing during prayer hours, no drinking without meals, no batches over a certain strength. Others turned a blind eye, as long as the monks kept showing up for lauds with their robes straight and their voices in tune. Still, problems arose. There are records of monks missing prayers, stumbling during chants, or falling asleep during readings. In one monastery, a brewmaster was quietly reassigned to garden duty, after rumours swirled that he'd lost count of the barrels and found the floor instead. Even the term cellarer, the monk in charge of storage and brewing, took on an unofficial double meaning in some abbeys. If the cellarer's cheerful, the saying went, the barrels are light. too cheerful, and well, someone's getting reassigned to sheep herding. Yet, for all the indulgences, there was rarely true scandal. Monasteries policed their own. Drunkenness wasn't encouraged, it was just occasionally tolerated, with a sigh, and maybe a little side-eye from the abbot. You finish your sip and set the cup down. Brother Conrad pats the barrel affectionately like a family dog. We walk the line, he says. It's just that sometimes the line's a bit wobbly. Outside, the rain has stopped. The bell rings for evening prayer. You walk back toward the chapel, chuckling softly. Because yes, monks were holy, but they were also human. The sun dips low again, casting a warm orange hush across the abbey's stonework. You walk beneath a colonnade of worn arches, each echoing with centuries of footfalls, some confident, some penitent, some just carrying barrels from one end of the monastery to the other. So far, this story has lingered on monks, their brewing, their fasting, their questionable quality control. But now we're shifting the lantern a little to the side, because behind the robed brothers stirring mash tuns and scrawling recipe notes in the margins of psalters, there was often someone else working quietly, women, and tonight you follow a whisper down the shadowed halls toward the laundry building. Yes, laundry, but not just socks and robes. Because in many monasteries, especially in their earliest days, women played a vital, if often uncredited, role in monastic brewing. It's a strange reality, isn't it? We picture beer making as a bearded monk affair, tucked away behind incense and stone. But brewing, like bread making, was a domestic task before it was ever a holy profession. And in the early medieval centuries, the line between domestic space and monastic space was a lot fuzzier than history books tend to admit. Inside the laundry annex, a warm hearth glows in the corner. A large copper kettle simmers, not beer this time, but water for soapwort and linen boiling. And there, tending it, is Sister Imelda, one of the laywomen who help support the abbey's work. She's not a nun, she hasn't taken vows, but she's been here for 15 years, helping with everything from herb gathering to grain drying. You sit nearby on a low bench as she talks softly, hands never stopping. We used to brew in the kitchen, before the brothers got their fancy house with the copper kettles, she says with a crooked smile. Same grain, same hands. She's not wrong. Before brewing became an institutional process, it was done on a small scale, often by women, using household tools and passed-down recipes. In early Christian Europe, some monastic communities included double houses, spaces where men and women lived in separate quarters, but served the same spiritual mission. And in those settings, women brewed. A lot. Historians still argue how involved women were in the brewing side of religious life as monastic structures hardened over time. Some believe women were slowly pushed out of the process as beer became more profitable and more public. Others argue their role just became more hidden, support work rebranded as household duties. But the evidence is there if you know where to look. In some abbey records you'll find references to brew widows, older women who stayed on monastery grounds after their husbands died, tasked with preparing mash or straining ale. In others, nuns themselves were documented as brewing, for themselves, for charity, even for sale. One of the earliest known female brewers, St. Hildegard of Bingen. Yes, that Hildegard. Visionary, composer, and apparently hops advocate. Here's your quirky tidbit for the evening. St. Hildegard was one of the first writers to describe the preservative properties of hops in beer. She called them a bitter herb that prevents putrefaction. In other words, add hops or drink sludge. And while the monks got the brewing fame, many of the foundational skills, grain sorting, flavour balancing, herbal additions, were likely carried over from women's work. Passed quietly, repeated daily, never signed, never praised, but always there. You follow Sister Imelda outside now. She walks with a slight limp, the kind you earn after decades of hauling sacks of barley and stirring hot kettles with wooden paddles half your size. Behind the brew house she points to a drying shed where bundles of herbs hang, sage, lavender, a little yarrow. They don't always ask, she says with a shrug, but they always use them. She's not bitter, just matter of fact. There were nunneries that brewed beer too, though far fewer than male abbeys. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries describe small-scale brewing in convents, often tied to hospitals or poorhouses. The beer was usually lighter, sometimes mixed with fruit or herbs, and served to the sick. But the skill, still impressive. And yet, as the brewing business grew, especially in the late Middle Ages, Women were gradually squeezed out. Beer shifted from sustenance to economy, and with that shift came gendered assumptions about who was serious enough to brew. Spoiler, it wasn't the washerwoman with 20 years of fermentation wisdom. Still, the legacy lingers. You sit beneath a fig tree with Sister Imelda now, the evening thick with the scent of drying grain and wood smoke. She offers you a sip from her own cup. Not from the monk's batch, but her own. A little sweeter, spiced. It tastes like cloves and honey, and something faintly earthy you can't name. Old recipe, she says. My mother's, brewed for winter nights when the cows stopped giving milk, you nod. The mug is warm in your hands, the taste lingers, so does the silence. Historians might not always write her name, but her flavour, her method, her memory, they're still here, carried in each careful pour. Morning breaks with an unexpected clang, a sharper, more metallic sound than the usual comforting bell tones. You stir from your warm spot near the refectory, drawn by the noise, by the sense that something's shifting. Monks rush past, robes hiked up, eyes wide. Brother Arnold doesn't greet you with his usual sleepy nod. He's heading toward the brewhouse. Fast. You follow, sensing something different in the air. And you're right. Everything's about to change. Because this chapter isn't about brewing's triumphs or sacred rhythms. Tonight, you arrive at the breaking point. The moment when monasteries and beer were ripped apart, not by time or taste, but by politics, power, and a little thing called the Reformation. The brewhouse door hangs open, steam billowing out as Brother Hugo hauls out barrels, stacking them outside in a rush. Inventory, he mutters. But there's tension in the air, sharp as flint. You glance toward the gate where a man in a dark cloak waits, scrolls under his arm and a look of satisfaction on his face. He's not here for a pint, he's here for everything. The 16th century brought thunder. Across Europe, the Protestant Reformation cracked through the Catholic world like a fault line. It wasn't just about theology, it was about control, power, land. And guess who had plenty of land, money and tasty beer recipes? The monasteries. You step carefully through the now buzzing courtyard, watching monks scramble to move barrels, books and bags of grain. This is no fire drill. In some parts of Europe, England especially, the Reformation didn't just close a few chapels. It dissolved monasteries completely. Their land seized, their libraries looted, their brewhouses smashed or sold off to the nearest noble, with a thirst and a little gold. In England, King Henry VIII ordered the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s. At first it was about reforming corruption, but very quickly it became about treasure, stone, silver, land, and yes, beer. Some monasteries resisted quietly, others surrendered under pressure or promises of pension. Monks fled, some joined Protestant ranks, others vanished into lay life, their robes exchanged for tunics and their brews now whispered family recipes. You pass one such monk now, Brother Edric, formerly of Glastonbury, now just a man with calloused hands and a haunted look. He used to brew for pilgrims, now he brews in secret, behind an old granary. Historians still debate whether these dissolutions destroyed brewing innovation, or simply displaced it. Some say knowledge was lost forever, books burned, barrels smashed. Others believe much of it was preserved, hidden, handed down or absorbed into secular brewing. But one thing's for sure, beer changed. Once out of monastic hands, brewing became more commercial. Guilds formed, brewing licenses appeared. Ale became a taxable product, no longer an offering of charity but a transaction. Public taverns flourished, and while some secular brewers maintained quality, the soul of monastic brewing, the prayerful patience, the care for pilgrims and poor faded into the background. Here's your quirky tidbit. One English town was so desperate to keep its abbey beer flowing that townspeople tried to adopt a few monks and hire them as local brewers under new names. It worked, until the crown caught wind and taxed every barrel twice. You step into what was once the herbarium, a garden now half dug, its borders disrupted by surveyors measuring the land for future use. Brother Remigius is here, kneeling beside the last of the yarrow and sweet gale, muttering a psalm under his breath. He plucks a stem and tucks it into his robe, as if saving a memory. And it's not just England. Across Germany, the Low Countries and parts of France, monasteries faced increasing pressure. Protestant reformers criticised monastic wealth, questioned the ethics of brew for salvation, and declared beer a worldly indulgence. Some monks pushed back. In Belgium, a few abbeys went underground, literally. Brewing continued in cellars, passed on like a family heirloom. Others went public, partnering with secular brewers to keep the recipes alive. You sit now beside the cloister wall, the sounds of hammering and shouting in the background. This place, once a sanctuary of stillness and foam, is being deconstructed, brick by brick, barrel by barrel. Brother Arnold joins you, handing over a mug that tastes distinctly heavier, darker. Last of the feast day brew, he says. Too strong to share, too good to waste. He sips, you sip. The rain begins again, soft and quiet. And as the brew house loses its purpose, you can't help but feel like you're watching something sacred dissolve. Not just beer, but a whole way of life. Historians still argue whether the loss of monastic brewing was a tragedy or simply evolution. Some say it democratized beer, others say it stripped it of its meaning. But here, in this moment, you don't care about sides or theses or scrolls nailed to doors. You care about the mug in your hand, the monk beside you, the last whisper of prayer in the steam. This isn't the end, but it is the last pour for a long time. You return days later, or maybe centuries. Time feels blurred in this place, where echoes linger like mist over morning fields. The abbey is quieter now. The crowds of pilgrims are gone, the clatter of carts and chatter of guest halls silenced. But you hear something, faint at first, a whisper in the stone, a bubbling in the barrel, a monk's low chant carried by the wind. It survived. The monastic brewing tradition, like so many things worn thin by time, was never truly erased. It merely rested, like a good ale, waiting in dark cellars and deeper memory. And tonight, you arrive at the rebirth. Modern monks are brewing again. You're in Belgium now, though you could be in Austria, the Netherlands, or even America. The language is different, but the rhythm is familiar. Chant, brew, pray, repeat. The abbey here looks new, well, newer. Parts of it were rebuilt after war, others modernised with electricity, stainless steel tanks and internet access. But the brew house, it still hums like an old song. A Trappist monk, Brother Jean, greets you with a soft smile. He wears work gloves over his robes and has a patch of barley husk in his beard. He leads you through a spotless brew hall where modern equipment shines, but the heart remains ancient. Monks like Brother Jean are part of a small dedicated group keeping the tradition alive, not out of nostalgia, not for profit, but because they believe beer can still be holy, still useful, still good. You watch as he gently stirs a mash tun, then walks to the fermentation tanks. Everything here is clean, quiet, deliberate, and yes, still deeply prayerful. Each batch begins with prayer. Each bottle is handled by monks. No machines rush the process. No advertising campaigns chase profit. Trappist beer, officially designated and protected, must meet specific criteria. It must be brewed within a monastery, supervised by monks. Profits must go to support the monastery or charitable causes. It is quite literally beer with a mission. You sip from a glass now. Yes, glass, not clay. It's golden, effervescent, with a head that clings to the rim like the final verse of a hymn. The taste is layered. Citrus, spice, subtle bitterness. It's refined, balanced and unexpectedly modern. This is Chimay, or maybe West Vleteren, or Rochefort. There are only a few true Trappist breweries left, and each guards its recipes with monastic calm. Some produce just enough to support themselves, others operate on a slightly larger scale, but all stay rooted in the same ancient purpose, and people notice. Travellers once again make pilgrimages, not just to see relics, but to taste them. They sip, reflect, and maybe, just maybe, feel something deeper than thirst. You walk now through a small museum off the abbey's main hall. Photographs of past monks line the walls, some in black and white, some smiling, others stern. One has his arms folded proudly in front of a row of oak barrels captioned, Brother Alphonse, 1962, Master of the Yeast. Beside it, a framed copy of an old recipe, penned in Latin just like the ones in that scriptorium centuries ago. The handwriting is neater, the ratios clearer, but the spirit, the same. You pause at a small plaque. It reads, "To brew is to serve is to love. May each bottle remind you of the quiet hands who made it." And that's what modern monastic brewing is. Not a return, but a continuation. Historians still debate whether the new Trappist breweries reflect the same spiritual values as their medieval ancestors. Is it the same if the tools are modern? If the ingredients are shipped in from elsewhere, does it matter? You think back to Brother Arnold and Sister Imelda, to Brother Remigius with his little test batch, to Brother Conrad and his suspiciously strong abbot's nap, to pilgrims resting their feet and sipping from cracked jugs, and you realise, yes, because the heart of it hasn't changed. The world outside moves faster now, louder, less forgiving. But inside these stone walls, or their rebuilt versions, the rhythm continues. Ora et labora, pray and work, brew and serve, quietly, faithfully, foaming with intention. You step back outside into a golden field, barley swaying gently in the breeze. The sun dips low. Somewhere, a bell rings, and you can't help but smile, thinking of all the hands that have stirred mash, whispered prayers, lifted mugs. The line never broke. It just went underground for a while, and now it bubbles again. And now, as the final brew settles and the sun vanishes beyond the cloister walls, you rest. The air cools. The wind softens. Even the birds have hushed their wings. You picture the monastery now, still and golden, wrapped in twilight. The brew house is quiet, its last flame extinguished. Barrels rest in the cellar like sleeping giants, and not a single mug clinks in the guest hall. Everything waits. Even Brother Arnold has finally put down his ladle. Somewhere he's nodded off in his chair, arms crossed, dreaming of barley fields that stretch into eternity. You walk once more past the herb garden, past the empty cup left on a bench, still warm. You imagine the taste, soft, comforting, earthy, a memory on your tongue. Monks still walk these halls even if you can't see them. Their chants linger, their recipes echo. Their care lives on in every sip, every quiet act of craftsmanship. A gift passed from hand to hand, from age to age, like flame shared between candles. And you've walked through centuries, heard the whisper of barrels, felt the rhythm of a life brewed with purpose. Now your body softens, your breath slows. The warmth of their legacy wraps around you like a blanket. You don't need another sip, just stillness, stillness, and the slow fade of history into silence, sweet dreams.